In the mountains of Mozambique, one reigns supreme, towering above all the others, Mount Nemuli. Within the depths of the caves of Nemuli, God was forming something special, a sacred people called the Makua. Eventually, once these people were numerous enough, they descended upon the world, and they came upon a river. The Makua crossed the river by forming a bridge of rope that broke once some had crossed. This was a sign from God that some should stay behind, while the others forged ahead. This happened several times, and every time some were left behind, they would form a new subsect of the Makua people that populate Mozambique. As human migration goes, the area of Mozambique was one of the first migrated to within Africa. And so, people and proto-people have resided in Mozambique for many millennia. The first civilization to appear in the region is the semi-nomadic San civilization. They came to the region from South Africa, but it is difficult to say much else on these people's role in the region, simply due to their constant movement to adapt with the unpredictable climate of Africa. A new wave of immigration came to Mozambique with the Bantu expansion that came from the jungles of the Congo. The Bantu pushed the San people west from Mozambique and established stationary farms. The Bantu people brought to the region domesticated plants, goats, and cattle, as well as some metalworking, which began this region's Iron Age. Mostly, the Bantu people settled along the Zambezi River and the Mozambique coast, with more stable settlements. More nomadic people lived further inland, further from the water sources. Now, the local people began profiting off of the Indian Ocean trade network, with the port city Xiu-Bene becoming a gateway for the Mozambicans to receive foreign goods for their pottery and beads. A few more trade ports appeared along the coast further north, which began to drain Xiu-Bene of their wealth. These new trade ports were not part of a larger kingdom or nation, but individual city-states profiting for themselves. This is where we see Muslim influence in the region begin, as Arabic traders visited the coast and introduced Mozambique to Islam. However, they also began the slave trade as a fairly profitable market for the Africans. These Arabs, especially in the north of Mozambique, intermixed with the local Bantu people, and from this, the Swahili culture arose. These people ruled the trade in their city-states, but almost none of the people in the interior were affected by this power. The city of Sofala held significant trade power, as they were the gateway for Great Zimbabwe to trade with the rest of the world. Sofala had a monopoly over regional trade, and eventually were annexed by Great Zimbabwe for their wealth. Sofala was also the center of the southern African gold trade, especially as they came under the rule of the Mutapa kingdom, which exponentially grew the wealth of Sofala. Another fairly rich state was the Swahili island of Mozambique, which was found further north, just off the coast of mainland Africa. And in northern Mozambique, the Moravi Confederacy took control of trade, as they conquered their way from the interior to the coast, taking hold of many important ports. Soon, a Portuguese explorer, Vasco da Gama, arrived from the south at the island of Mozambique. Although initially making little impact, his short visit paved the way for Portuguese colonialism in the region. Da Gama, once returned to Portugal, spoke of Mozambique, and very soon after, Portuguese settlers began to overrun former Swahili and Arab trading ports, forcing them into the hands of the Portuguese. Both of the most important city-states, the island of Mozambique and Sofala, became Portuguese trading ports as they pushed the local kingdoms out. The Portuguese were now in control of the Mozambican trade. The Portuguese also began other settlements in the interior of Mozambique, hoping to find gold deposits so that they could exploit the resource themselves, rather than rely on local kingdoms to supply them their gold. As the Portuguese lost settlements along the Somali coast, the importance of Mozambican trade ports grew exponentially. However, investment from the motherland was somewhat lacking, as Portugal focused on the colonization of Brazil. During this time, the slave market grew, as slaves were sold to the new markets of the Americas and other European colonies, while continuing to supply Arab nations. Although, very soon an agreement with England led to the abolishment of slavery in both Portugal and its colonies. There was now a displacement of people from South Africa who, as they migrated north, stole cattle and killed many in their way. These Ngoni people attempted several times to settle in Mozambique, but every time they were chased off by locals, angry with the thievery and murder the people brought with them. They eventually settled just north of Mozambique, but would continue raids into Mozambique, stealing cattle to sustain themselves. However, another group of Ngoni people were able to maintain a foothold in southern Mozambique, and created the Gaza Empire. Gaza was able to chase off the Portuguese from the lands, and imposed a Zulu-style ruling system. The local, mostly Tsonga people would slowly fuse with the Ngoni, creating an internally peaceful empire. The Portuguese hated Gaza, but were not able to do much as they had very little military presence in the region, and so had to just watch as local people govern themselves. And, at one point, Gaza even had the Portuguese paying them tribute. So now, one of the priorities of the Portuguese was to oust the Gaza Empire. And the perfect situation had been brewing. As the Ngoni subjugated many local people, these people had to pay tribute to the king, and if not, they would be attacked mercilessly. The king at the time, Ngunganyane, was especially brutal to his tribal people, which caused an important hatred for the Gaza Empire among its citizens that the Portuguese would take advantage of. The Portuguese assembled an army of colonial troops and local people fed up with the Gazan rule. This force was able to push the king back until he was captured and exiled to the Azores. Portugal was now fully in control of the land, and now that the largest threat was taken care of, the colonizers turned their attention to consolidating the rest of Mozambique from the less powerful tribes and chiefdoms. But the Portuguese crown was severely in debt from the numerous expeditions and wars fought in recent years. So, this led to a global trend of allowing companies to basically rule the colony under Portuguese direction. These companies established railroads and developed many parts of the nation's infrastructure, but at the same time controlled mines and plantations. Although slavery was illegal in the Portuguese Empire, these companies exploited the local workforce with forced labor, meaning that the people were forced to work in inhumane conditions for little pay, with threat of serious mutilation or death if quotas weren't met or someone tries to escape. These people were paid just enough to survive, and were forced into debts to the company that would take generations to pay off at the rate the individuals were paid. Eventually, once the land was more established and needed less investment, the Portuguese stripped power from these companies and finally totally and directly controlled the lands of Mozambique. However, the treatment of the local people, if not remained the same, became worse, as the colonial ruler increased taxes on the Africans, bleeding them dry, and giving most no choice but to work in the mines and plantations. Most of the suitable farmland was taken by Portugal to be farmed for Portuguese interest and cash crops, leaving only unfarmable land for the local people to live off of. This began artificial food shortages in the region. Even after World War II, with the nation being unburdened by war, and the global pricing of Mozambican goods skyrocketing, the living conditions for the African population remained the same, while the new wave of white settlers flowed into Mozambique to take advantage of the new job opportunities and promise of wealth from these hiked commodity prices. Africans were not allowed to be hired in these high-paying jobs, so that the Portuguese would still have their massive workforce, while improving the lives of numerous white Portuguese settlers. Anyone who would dissent or even speak out against the Portuguese colonial rule were exiled, imprisoned, or killed, which helped the Portuguese avoid civil war, even with a massive population of discontent Africans. In one instance, a northeastern independence movement began to demonstrate in the town of Mueda. Here, the Portuguese arrested political leaders and fired upon the crowd mercilessly. This didn't stop a liberation movement from forming though, as many exiled Mozambicans grouped up in Tanzania and formed the Mozambique Liberation Front, also known as Frelimo, under the leadership of Eduardo Mondlane. The massacre in Mueda proved to the initially peaceful movement that there was no way that protests would solve the issue, and guerrilla warfare was the only way to achieve independence. The front asked NATO for aid, as they had been pressuring the Portuguese to relinquish control of their colonies, but stopped once Portugal threatened to leave NATO if pressures continued. This is where we see the Liberation Front turn to the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China for aid, seeing that they were willing to help many nations resisting Western influence. These nations provided military equipment, training, and funding for an independent Mozambique. However, the group proclaimed to be democratic socialist and not communist. The movement was freely allowed to operate in Tanzania, as the new nation felt sympathy for the freedom from oppression. And so, the Frelimo headquarters would start in Dar es Salaam, the largest city in Tanzania. After some years, the front felt that they were ready to overthrow the Portuguese, and began an offensive from the north. Due to the small size of the insurgent force, the front was counting on guerrilla tactics and local support to increase the army size as the war went on. The front was able to gain a firm hold in the north, and, as they liberated land, the movement began their public support campaign in allowing access to healthcare, education, and generally improving the lives of native Africans. But the war reached a stalemate as the Portuguese increased their military size to tens of thousands of troops, and the front was working with thousands. Eventually, to help with their numbers, the front even allowed women to fight in their ranks. Landmines were widely used by the front to create unease amongst the Portuguese and as a deterrent from the use of motorized vehicles. A counter-offensive was successful in reclaiming much of the liberated land, and at the town of Wiriamu, the Portuguese accused the local people of sheltering troops, leading to a massacre of between 150 to 300 civilians. The war was already extremely unpopular in Portugal, but as word reached the nation of this massacre, protests ramped up. This has been confirmed by many to have aided in the downfall of the Portuguese fascist government. Very soon after the Portuguese government was overthrown, a ceasefire was signed, and peace talks began over the independence of Mozambique. This scared the local white population, and, as many settlers were new to the region, there was a mass exodus of Portuguese people. After talks, the Mozambicans were able to achieve independence as a one-party state. However, as a majority of the educated high class abandoned the nation, it was faced with a major brain drain and a feared economic collapse. In spite of this, the front enacted many successful policies, increasing access to education, healthcare, and many social services to the benefit of the public. And they declared themselves as Marxist-Leninist communists. The front also began a campaign of killing or sending political opponents to re-education camps, in attempts to squash any new parties that could start a civil war for governmental control. As in Zimbabwe and South Africa, there was still a white ruling class. There were many movements to overthrow the non-representative governments, and Mozambique provided a safe haven for many of these rebels. This soured relations, especially with Zimbabwe, who was being economically starved by Mozambican sanctions. Mozambique was housing many revolutionaries of the Zimbabwe Civil War, and so, Zimbabwe forces crossed the border and destroyed many of their camps. They also targeted Mozambican infrastructure in retaliation for the support of the rebels. Zimbabwe used the political suppression of opposition in Mozambique to destabilize the nation, as they formed Renamo, a group whose goal was to topple the Mozambique Liberation Front government. They mostly operated from Zimbabwe and would raid villages, kidnapping people to fight for them. Renamo even had a large minority of child soldiers that they had kidnapped. As the war moved on, Renamo had established themselves in Mozambique, and frequently targeted infrastructure to try and starve the nation into submission in both funds and food. Eventually, the rebels lost support of Zimbabwe, as the rebels there had seen victory. Zimbabwe now began to support Frelimo, and in doing so, were subject to Renamo cross-border raids. Frelimo had growing global support, as initially, North Korea, the USSR, and East Germany aided Mozambique, and later, Zimbabwe, Tanzania, the UK, and the US, while Renamo only had support from South Africa. However, in spite of the immense support globally, Frelimo struggled economically as Renamo attacks had done their job in creating a Mozambican famine while bankrupting the nation. This lack of funds forced the nation to pull back on their expensive communist ideals, to the great disapproval of the communist bloc. Eventually, the white rule in South Africa came to an end, and so did the last support for Renamo, which forced the two sides into peace talks that ended in Mozambique becoming a multi-party nation. The first election ever in Mozambique was closely monitored by many outside officials and internal parties. Even though Frelimo won, it was almost unanimous that the election was free and fair, legitimizing Frelimo rule. And although not being a former member of the British Empire, the nation was accepted into the Commonwealth of Nations, seeking the benefits that accompany the membership. The nation saw immense international funding, which only increased with the discovery of natural gas and oil in the nation. This began a slow improvement to the economy, and aided the government with their massive civil war debt. In every election since the Civil War, the Frelimo party had won. Renamo claimed voter fraud, and took the case to the Supreme Court, but no evidence was found. In spite of this conclusion, many Renamo supporters took to the streets, but were attacked by the police after the demonstrations were declared illegal by the state. This caused a rift between the parties, and Renamo began training soldiers once again. After several years of training, Renamo soldiers attacked a police station, and throughout the northern region attacks like this continued, with a ceasefire called for the next election. Renamo was not happy with the results of this election, and so returned to their firearms and reignited the insurgency. But, after several more years of clashes, the two sides met and discussed a peace. This was achieved, and militants willingly gave up their arms in favor of peace and the reunification of the Mozambican people. But this wasn't all peaceful for Mozambique, as, during the unrest, an Islamist militant group arose in the northern provinces, claiming that Islam in Mozambique had strayed too far from the teachings of Muhammad. These people conduct many terror attacks and continue to receive funding from the trade of illegal materials, like ivory and heroin. Very soon, 2 cyclones would hit the coast of Mozambique, displacing over 1,000 residents and killing around 600. The disaster also severely damaged infrastructure, mainly in northern provinces. And the nation, unable to properly aid and test for COVID-19, has taken many measures to protect its citizens, by banning gatherings of more than 50, closing schools, and banning all visitors with entry visas. These measures have kept the nation with a relatively low amount of cases. And that is the state of the nation of Mozambique.